My new book, Awake, Observe, Shape, Transform, is now available on Amazon, along with the 90-day transformation journal. You'll find a link to these things in the episode description. Also, if you'd like to support this work, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers with no locked content, just a way to say I value this. You can also visit the site and check out the growing merch store, shirts, tanks, hats, and learn about one-on-one sessions with me by clicking the About button. And don't forget, the YouTube page has the podcast and binaural beats for meditation, rest, and sleep. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we are revisiting channeling with one of the most famous channelers and one of my personal favorites, Esther Hicks, who began channeling a collective of intelligences that she referred to as Abraham. We'll get into the law of attraction as Esther understands it through Abraham, what it actually is, how it got framed, and where people tend to get stuck. Because whether you love this material or hate it or physically recoil every time someone says, just raise your vibration, there's no denying one thing. These teachings reshaped modern spirituality, changed the language people use to talk about desire, about emotion, about reality itself. And at the same time, it confused a lot of people, myself included. It helped some people deeply, myself included, and unintentionally hurt some of them, myself included. So today I want to slow this way down and separate what works from what got distorted. So here we are, Esther Hicks and Abraham, the Vortex, the Grid, and the Law of Attraction. Esther Hicks, and who or what is Abraham? In the late 1980s, Esther began channeling what she describes as Abraham, which is actually a collection of non-physical intelligences. It's important to understand that Abraham is not a single entity. It's not a personality with a backstory. It's not a ghost. It's not a spirit. It's not a he or a she. It's not a barista from a local coffee shop that falls somewhere in between there, but it's a collective, a hive mind, you would say, which honestly is one of the things that for me, for whatever reason, legitimizes Esther's explanation. And honestly, through my filters and what I know, that idea that Abraham's a collective actually makes the information more solid. Why? Because beyond the body, there is no quote unquote I. Think about it. What we understand or know is that spirits of all ways, shapes, and forms are still trapped in samsara. They're still trapped in the cycle of suffering. And they can't be trusted any more than anyone else with a body. They are still in an identity. Sorry, Bashar. You see, the world that they're in is still being filtered through their mind, through their preferences. In other words, not having a body is not a sudden qualification for knowledge or enlightenment. In fact, when we start to resort to that kind of thinking, it reminds me of being a child where height is the only requirement for intelligence. And you see how that turned out. You got older and realized, oh, they were just taller. They weren't smarter. So anyway, Abraham, this collective, speaks through Esther, and it's often quick, funny, and always with a very consistent framework, which is important to note. And like always, when we're dealing with channeling, you do not need to believe in channeling to evaluate the work or the content. In fact, that sort of debate tends to distract people from the real question, which is, does this framework, do these ideas that Esther is transmitting, do they help human beings relate to their inner experience in a healthier way? That's the only question worth asking. Otherwise, we're just arguing over the Shroud of Turin rather than appreciating the lessons of Jesus Christ. That argument and need for objectivity is what's ruining these religions, or has ruined them. The confusion between the difference in truth and fact seems to be a real issue when it comes to this sort of thing. So, at the center of Abraham's teachings is the simple idea that you are not bringing things into your life through effort. You are attracting things through a state of being. So it's not what you want, not what you say you want, but what you are habitually oriented toward. In other words, your emotional baseline, your inner posture, so to speak. That's the signal. And life responds to that signal. I guess you could say it's more about what you feel, a la Neville Goddard in his book titled Feeling is the Secret, as opposed to what you think about the most or even wish for. I'd also like to state, before we get too far into the teachings of what have become known as Abraham Hicks, my understanding of the law of attraction has more to do with what I'm attracted to rather than what I attract to me. Remember, this is always about personal responsibility. In other words, you don't attract wounded narcissists because you're this throbbing, vibrating, glowing empath. That leaves you in a place where you have to figure them out rather than the important and more difficult work of trying to figure out what aspect of your subconscious is manifesting or revealing to you ways by which getting close to a wounded narcissist is possible and even in some cases necessary. See, that's the job of the subconscious mind. It shows you the way. And you could say, but that's not what I want. I never think about getting close to them. Yeah, I know. That's why it's the subconscious mind. Again, self-reliance and personal responsibility. It's not what you attracted, but what you are attracted to. Think about that. Now, it's not that my opinion of these things varies that much from Abraham, but I do think that individuals benefit from this slight shift in perspective. Like I said at the start, I too have been confused by these teachings. So the role of the mind, remember, is to find patterns. And it will continually find ways for these patterns to be possible, or what the repeated perception is. It wants the perception, as Neville Goddard would say, the assumption to be true. Remember, the mind doesn't believe what's true, it believes what it repeats. The pattern might be bad, but the patterns are consistent, and consistency equals safety to the mind. For instance, you could say that someone is attracted to manipulative relationships because they too are manipulative. I see this a lot with clients. While they can certainly be victims of manipulation, you begin to uncover the ways in which they have used the sympathy of others after being manipulated to then manipulate situations in their favor or to feed into an identity. And it starts as kids, and it can be perfectly innocent, but then could manifest into chaos and a string of bad relationships as an adult. Again, this is obviously an unconscious thing. The ego being personal importance, personal identity, and reality testing, the reinforcement of identity is an evolutionary feature, even if it's a shitty identity. I'd go so far as to call it a biological imperative, since not having importance or an identity would have meant that you were a drain on resources. And that was a dangerous thing at one point in our iteration as human beings, meaning that their victimhood has to be reinforced. So back to our previously mentioned empath, they get wounded, and then the aspect of the ego that needs to be the hero, the savior, the martyr, gets satisfied. I mean, it's gross, but it's stuff that we all have to look at if we want to get free of certain things. For example, the identity of being a person that helps others isn't bad, but when we're unskillful, it's dangerous. However, once we learn where the wounded pieces are and start to resist the urges to fulfill those sick little urges or corrupt data that sits in the subconscious, then we get the opportunity to be a skillful helper. It's the law of correspondence. There is a positive and negative pole to everything. So for the empath, for instance, they could learn to feel into the pain of others rather than taking the pain of others personally. I have to feel into the pain of others in order to do the trauma work that I do. I have to be empathetic, but I cannot act like a pathetic empath. There's a difference. I'm sure everything I've been saying in this last bit has been taken personally by someone, and all I can say is it's just stuff you have to look at, and that's all. So when Abraham talks about vibration, a lot of people get stuck. They imagine energy fields and frequencies or something mystical that they're supposed to maintain, but what vibration means is that you are keeping your thoughts, your language, your emotions, your nervous system all moving in the same direction. You don't want them contradicting each other. You don't want them fighting each other. You want them all to be in support of the same desire. All that really is coherence. Coherence means to be logical and consistent, to form a unified whole. So you keep your thoughts, your actions, your nervous system moving in the same direction, forming a unified whole. Now, when you're incoherent, when you're illogical or inconsistent, you feel tense, you feel scattered, defensive, exhausted. When you're coherent, you feel clearer, steadier, and more open. Now, the vortex is one of Abraham's most famous concepts and also one of the most misunderstood. Abraham describes the vortex as a vibrational holding place for everything you've ever wanted. It's a state of alignment with your own well-being. When you're in the vortex, you're not chasing relief. You are resting in it. Everything is being drawn down to you. I find this to be most helpful as a visualization. A vortex is essentially a whirlpool or swirling water, so I tend to imagine being at the bottom of a swirling, whirling mass of energy where things are being drawn in and pulled down toward me. So here is where people get tangled up. They start treating the vortex like a scoreboard. If I feel bad, I'm out. If I feel something that doesn't manifest, I failed, and I did something incorrectly. If I'm struggling with an emotion, then I must be misaligned. But that kind of thinking turns a guidance system into some sort of moral system. Abraham never taught that negative emotion was wrong. They taught that it was informational, because really we want emotional guidance, not emotional policing. One of the most valuable contributions of this teaching, when properly understood, is emotional literacy. Abraham consistently says, your emotions tell you where you are in relation to yourself. That's very interesting. Sadness doesn't mean you're broken. Anger doesn't mean that you're unspiritual. Fear doesn't mean that you're failing at manifestation. It means something inside you is asking for attention. It's a very different relationship with feeling than most of us are taught. Rather than fighting to change an emotional state, it's more important to find out what is in your mind that is causing it. Otherwise, it's just going to keep showing up over and over again. So another major concept used by Abraham is the grid. Abraham describes the grid as something you can activate when you think thoughts of appreciation, ease, allowing, or allowance. But some people take this literally. They imagine like this cosmic infrastructure being switched on. But functionally, the concept of the grid points to this. Repeated focus trains perception, okay? What you repeatedly focus on will train your perception to find that thing. When you consistently notice what's working, you stop looking for threats. Your nervous system shifts out of survival mode. Your mind is now flexible. Your behavior changes. And what you find out is that opportunities appear, and not because they were created, but because you can finally see them. This is that idea that the world that we inhabit as humans is actually a field of infinite possibilities. Just a different way to look at this thing. So the mind has these 6 cognitive faculties. 2 of them are consciousness and perception. Little c consciousness simply means that, or it's really like what you're aware of, what you're not aware of. You only know what you know. You don't know what you don't know. Perception means, as I've said a million times to you guys, it means the way you regard, interpret, and understand something. I believe that we miss a lot of these possibilities because of these 2 faculties. That being said, I think that we can broaden them with language, meaning that we will see the things we say, okay? We see things we say. If we're constantly describing a limited world with few opportunities to manifest our desires, then that's the world we live in. It's kind of simple. So what this requires is imagination and a willingness to stand in the face of our rotten perception and begin describing the things we don't quite see yet. This is the benefit of a journal. Why does a journal work? Because thoughts are slippery. Can't hold on to them. They are constantly changing and jumping from one thing to the next. So trying to do this strictly in your head is very difficult. However, if we can write them down and see them in the material world, then it gives us a chance to do that. And to do what Abraham said, that what you focus on and concentrate on, you will see more of it. You will look for the possibilities of that thing. And if you would like, you can go in my website and purchase the Awake Journal that accompanies the book. It's a prompt journal. It's already got prompts in it, so you don't have to think about stuff. Now, the next piece is appreciation. And appreciation is often misunderstood as denial, meaning we are denying the difficulty or whatever. But Abraham never taught denial. Abraham taught relief first. Not joy, not ecstasy, but relief. Relief is the nervous system letting go of resistance. That's the doorway. Christy and I were just talking about this yesterday. Often we pray for that particular job or whatever, but like most things, there can be frustration and complication with them once they're acquired. But it's important to remember that it's a prayer that was answered, right? To remember that you asked for it. And so you get this evidence that source God is listening, right? And that kind of relief comes from looking and going, oh my God, it's working, right? You're not confused by it. You're seeing it happen. And this is something I say to clients all the time. It's like, you're in this mess because you described it, right? And be playful with it. We're very playful with this. We have fun with it. So I guess appreciation maybe isn't the word, right? It's probably gratitude, and not that fake gratitude, but really sit and feel how things really have been okay. They're always okay in the end. This doesn't mean that we don't complain or that we don't have a bad day. Of course we do. It happens, but we have to keep a current of gratitude running beneath it all. This isn't about toxic positivity. It's just about gratitude. Maybe it's more like, okay, things are okay. I'm safe. I'm taken care of. And that little spark of relief allows us to work on our desires in a way that isn't frantic or desperate, right? It allows for divine timing rather than us forcing everything. I'll share a personal story. There was a time when I was out of work and had no prospects on the horizon. And every day I'm watching that number in my checking account tick down. In fact, this can probably apply to various times of the month for most Americans. But what I do is I look at the number every morning and say, this is enough money for today. And when my mind would try to take me into the future, I'd bring my attention back to my breath and repeat it again. This is enough money for today. Now, this doesn't mean that I wasn't actively in pursuit of more work. Obviously, I was. But it just kept the mantra running. This is enough for today. And when I sat with that reality, that was enough for today. It was, I'd feel ease. I'd feel that rest, that relief, that ease allowed me to stay positive. It allowed me to be confident, not hopeful, but confident, right? Fuck hope. Hope is for a stupid poster on the wall of your therapist's office. Your therapist is, the one selling hope, which is why you've been seeing them for so long with no solutions or progress. Hope is not a strategy. Most therapists don't use strategy. They use hope. This is probably why you've had the same therapist for so long, and it seems more like a rent-a-friend that is legally bound to keep your secrets, which is fine, I guess. But, telling myself that this was enough for today, even when honestly it wasn't, gave me a sense of relief. Notice I used the word sense because, let's face it, actual relief would have been in the form of money, but that sense gave me room to breathe. and to think clearly rather than to be desperate. And when I'd feel that minute or even a second of peace, I'd say thank you and consider how I've always been taken care of and that I'd be taken care of again. I just had to stay grateful and keep moving forward. Remember, this is never about being wishful. Being grateful to God or source or whatever doesn't mean that you are complacent and just sitting there waiting for your reward. The universe is active and creative, so act like the universe. Now, this might be a hot take, but the law of attraction got commodified by people with financial safety nets. It got turned into a spiritual performance. It got turned into think happy, get stuff. Think wrong, lose stuff. But that understanding of all of this creates anxiety and self-blame, and ironically, it moves people further from alignment. But it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, like, we live in this Judeo-Christian society that at its foundation has a religion based on punishment and reward. It lacks any neutrality. Its mysticism and mythology is so incoherent that it required the creation of a cosmic villain through translation gymnastics and propaganda, because the simple truth that all of the suffering and misery of the human race is due to its own misunderstanding of its true identity as souls. Instead, we fully identify with the human organism that is filled with biological imperatives that are rooted in the fear that someone is going to take our stuff. So yeah, that makes sense that that's how we feel about this. And even if you had one nation that decided to awaken and be fully aligned with God, they'd still have to deal with these other nations that are preoccupied with the occupation of resources out of fear. The problem is that the neutral space is where the truth lies. That's the fucking rub. But being an all or nothing culture, it's very difficult to be in that gray fuzzy space. It's not a natural place for us as Americans to sit. Now, one of the biggest misunderstandings is thinking that manifestation is something that you do. But in Abraham's original framework, manifestation is a side effect of alignment. It's not a job. You don't manifest by trying harder. You manifest by stopping the fight with yourself. When the fight stops, things reorganize. The hardest part for most is that this happens internally first. It happens externally second. Most folks have the belief that they would feel better if the external world was different. In other words, they believe that they can't change until the external world changes. This is a misperception. And it's one of the 5 kleshas mentioned in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So for those that are unaware, klesha essentially means poison or source of suffering. And the klesha here that we're talking about is called avidya, which means misperception causes suffering. More accurately, it's a spiritual misperception. We have mistaken the impermanent for the permanent. We have mistaken harmful things for pleasurable things. And in this case, we have misperceived that we are perceiving an external world that is somehow not directly related to our internal world. Also, note that manifestation means to reveal. A ship's manifest reveals what's aboard. So to manifest does not mean that we pull a rabbit out of a hat or something out of thin air. Instead, try seeing it this way. The subconscious mind is revealing the world to you. So the world manifests for you through the subconscious mind. You see, this is, again, an internal process. The mind finds a way to make something possible. This is something people don't seem to understand. It's the mind's role. It's the mind's job to find a way to make its beliefs true. So the mind doesn't believe what's true, it believes what it repeats. So it finds a way to make possible the circumstances that it has experienced in the past based on repeated responses. So a lot of this is going to change when you respond differently. And what's that? That's karma. Karma means doing. Stop doing the same thing over and over again, and over time, the subconscious mind will stop manifesting those experiences. That's what this is. I don't know how else to say it to you. This isn't a mystical scorekeeping system. Now, something to note, alignment is about relationship. Alignment is not, it's not control. Being in alignment is not about controlling reality. It's about being in the right relationship with your experience. So the vortex doesn't punish you for leaving. It doesn't close. It doesn't withdraw love. It's always there. You're just not standing in it. So one of the reasons Esther Hicks and Abraham resonated so widely is because this material didn't come out of nowhere. It sounds new, it feels modern, but the way in which it functions is very old. Very, very old, actually. What Abraham articulated in contemporary language has clear pillars in Buddhism, Hindu philosophy, and in the New Thought movement, even though each tradition frames the insight differently. It's the same art, different frame. So let's start with a comparison to Buddhism, because the overlap between Abraham's teaching and Buddhism is very clean. So Buddhism teaches that suffering doesn't come from events themselves. It comes from clinging. It comes from aversion and, again, misperception, avidya, meaning that the issue, if there is one, has more to do with how the mind relates to things rather than the things themselves. So it's not death, it's the way you relate to death, or more accurately, the way the mind relates to death. And Abraham says essentially the same thing, just different words. So when Abraham talks about being out of the vortex or out of alignment, what they're describing there is resistance. Resistance to the reality of the situation, resistance to what is, resistance to how you're feeling. In other words, constantly needing to change it rather than being there with it, as trite and fluffy as that sounds. And to double down on the triteness, it is resistance to the present moment. So within Buddhist Dharma, that's considered attachment and aversion. Buddha never said to feel good all the time. In fact, it's more about being with what is and allowing it to move through you and to simply observe it moving through you. You're not pushing or pulling. You're simply allowing the current emotional state to change on its own. What has the nature to arise has the nature to recede. Now, when we're in avidya, misperception, we believe that our current emotional state is due to external circumstances themselves when it's actually due to the way our mind is perceiving or relating to the external circumstances. Great example, personal story would be while my mom was dying. She went in for something routine, things got complicated, but then after her surgery, they extubated her, and when they did, something happened and she lost the ability to swallow. They said it could come back, but it never did. And rather than having a feeding tube, she elected to starve. Now, this wasn't malpractice, okay? It was just one of those things. In fact, it happens to 40% of the people that have that surgery. And when you're an 84-year-old woman, probably goes up from there. Well, her sisters didn't see it that way. So their minds related to the experience through anger, through outrage. They would show up and raise hell, yell at nurses, yell at doctors, and all that. However, I saw it as this is just how things are going to end. I now had to walk my mom home, which is how I was relating to the entire situation from the start, really. When she was awake, we'd exchange I love yous. When she was asleep, I'd pray, chant, cry, and read. I'd read the Upanishads. I'd read the Bhagavad Gita. One of my teachers once told me, you're on a plane and the plane is going from San Diego to Miami. It's a long flight. How you act on this plane is going to dictate what kind of a flight you have. So if this situation is a flight, the plane's already in the air. This is happening. There's no way around it. And all of the anger and outrage in the world isn't going to change it. So you might as well pray, chant, and say, I love you. That's alignment. I was aligned with what was happening. And in that alignment, I was doing what was spiritually appropriate at the time. Was I sad? Yes. Was I pushing and pulling? No. This is what is most important to understand, and it is antithetical to what we are told in our culture. And it's that there is such a thing as doing what needs to be done and not being attached to the outcome. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says you have a right to the action, but you do not have a right to the fruits of the action. In other words, you do what needs to be done because that's what needs to be done. Hand-wringing, whining, complaining, yelling at nurses and doctors, none of that benefits anyone. So in my situation, hold her hand. But I'm so sad, I need to go out and get some air. Hold her hand. Take the hose and get the blood and spit out of her throat. But this feels so bad, can't a nurse? Yes, but you're going to do it because that's your fucking mom. And that was my inner dialogue. All of it was just hard, but you do what you do because that's what you do. And what is that? That's bhakti yoga. It's Hanuman carrying the mountain to Ram. You do what you do because that's what you do no matter what. This is what's hard for people with no dedicated practice. They don't know what that means to do what you do no matter what. Everything Abraham taught requires consistent devotion, and most people just don't have that. They only have it when it feels good, or if they are seeing immediate results, and that's why people give up on these teachings. Shit, it's why people give up on diet and exercise. So Abraham emphasizes relief before happiness, not bliss, not excitement, relief. The maps almost perfectly align with Buddhism's teaching on equanimity. Equanimity means evenness of temper, no strong emotional response. However, it doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion. It goes along with what we were previously talking about with non-attachment. So equanimity isn't joy. It's just steadiness. It's even-keeled, and in that is relief before happiness. It's the nervous system settling enough so that you're not fighting with the experience. And from that steadiness, from that equanimous state comes clarity, relief. And from that clarity and that relief comes wise action. We're not acting thoughtfully, right? When we're wrapped around the axle and everything, we're just reacting. I tell this to clients all the time. We're here because of how your body feels. So that equanimous state, that evenness of temper means that your nervous system isn't urging you. You're not led by the body. And a lot of that is achieved through meditation or simply not acting on every urge you have. Deny the thoughts and feelings in the body and do something else. That's not manifestation language, but that's the same mechanism. All of that being said, here's an important difference. Buddhism is deeply suspicious of desire itself. Abraham, however, sees desire as natural and even necessary, and I tend to agree. I also believe that the dissatisfaction or suffering, as some would put it, is necessary as well. Waking up doesn't mean that you no longer experience dissatisfaction or grasping and clinging. It just means that you're aware of it. And in that awareness, we find that dissatisfaction loses its teeth. And that being the case, it causes the grasping and clinging to ease up. Buddhism often asks, what happens when you let go of wanting? Well, Abraham asks, what happens if you let wanting flow without resistance? I kind of like that concept. It's the same axis, but it's just a different emphasis. I see it that way anyway. One supposedly dissolves your desires, hopefully, while the other refines them. And I find that to be far more interesting than renunciation. Dissolving desires to me is like, you're not going to do that in a body. You're inhabiting this body with biological imperatives. Desire is part of the deal. So why not refine those desires? Now let's talk about Hinduism, because this is where the metaphysics line up really strongly. In Hindu philosophy, particularly Vedantic traditions or yogic traditions, suffering arises when the mind moves against Dharma. Now, I'd like to make a quick distinction here. I think it's important. Dharma is a Sanskrit word, yes, but in Buddhism, it means anything that the Buddha taught. Dharma in Hinduism means cosmic or personal law. In other words, the natural order of things or the right alignment of things, which I guess is the same as Buddhism, but ultimately, I don't know. I just needed to make that distinction. They're the same, but different. Anyway, Abraham's idea of alignment is functionally the same. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions are moving together, life flows. When you are in alignment, right? Things are going easily, they're flowing well. When you're in conflict, there's friction. So it's dharma, cosmic law, flow of things, versus adharma. Okay? As Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita, it is far better to perform one prescribed duty, though tinged with faults, than to perform another's prescribed duty, though perfectly. In fact, it is preferable to die in the discharge of one's duty than to follow the path of another, which is fraught with danger. Well, we all have our thing, right? You have to do your thing. Part of the problem with the culture is that everyone is chasing money, and in that chase, they find themselves stuck in jobs they hate, lives they hate. They find themselves locked onto a treadmill of things they didn't want, right? And they have to keep chasing that carrot. They have to keep the treadmill running. They're not doing what they want, what aligns with them. They are doing what the culture or the algorithm told them will give them, quote unquote, success or quote unquote happiness. They might have the trappings, but they don't have the happiness. Now, in Hinduism, there's also a distinction between conscious awareness, purusha, and the field of experience, prakriti. Awareness doesn't strain, it doesn't chase outcomes, it witnesses, it allows, and in that witnessing, there's a space. And that space gives the mind a chance to respond skillfully. So when Abraham talks about alignment, they're pointing to a mind that has stopped wrestling with experience. Again, a mind that's cooperating with the flow rather than trying to dominate it. That's living in accordance with Dharma. It's not positive thinking. Remember, being in alignment or being dharmic doesn't mean that you float just above the problems of life. It means that you have learned to be in the flow with whatever arises. And you are undisturbed. You aren't torn apart by it. That's Abraham's vortex. Now, here's where people usually confuse things. Karma is not punishment. It's not a mystical scorekeeping system, and attraction isn't a reward. They're just momentum. It's just the way things are. It's the nature of things. In Esther Hicks's book, Ask and It Is Given, which I highly recommend, Abraham tells us that the universe is a giant yes. The best way I can think to explain it is imagine that everything you talk about, everything that you think about is coming to you, like literally moving toward you. So that would mean that what you say and what you think really matters because it's pulling it into the vortex. However, I think it's more accurate to see it this way. Your mind will find a way to make possible the things that you talk about and the things that you think about, because really, that's the role of the mind, to find a way to make what is focused on possible, right? So if we sit around talking about our hopes and our dreams, that's very good. But if we also sit around and talk about the way or how hard it is to make those hopes and dreams possible, it's pulling those difficulties in as well, okay? So all patterns will repeat until awareness interrupts them. Abraham's emphasis on emotional momentum mirrors karma perfectly, but without this moral framing. honestly, I think the moral framing is the part that fucks everyone up. The way I was taught is that karma is neither good nor bad. It just is. Your mind is the one that creates the good or bad karma. So, you're not being judged. You're just riding these patterns. Change the pattern and the experience changes. Remember, the mind doesn't look for truth. It looks for repetition, right? It doesn't believe what's true. It believes what it repeats, good or bad. That's the case. And the mind does that because patterns are consistent, and consistency equals safety. Now, New Thought is where we find the historical roots for this way of thinking. There's Bible verses that say to pray as if it's already done, but as usual, there's instruction, but no actionable method. There's no directions, which seems to be pretty on brand for the Bible. The law of attraction didn't originate with Abraham Hicks. You can find it in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a man named Phineas Quimby, a couple named Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, and a man named Ernest Holmes. My personal favorites, Kate Atkinson Bohm, Florence Scovel Shinn, and of course, Neville Goddard, who is famous for the law of assumption, which I think makes more sense as far as a way to think about this stuff. I covered that in an episode 196 titled The Law of Assumption Explained. And the law of assumption, essentially, it's what your mind assumes is what you're going to experience. Now, what New Thought really emphasized is that the mind is causative. This means that the mind is the cause of your experience, not the external world. And this is important to understand, and it's something that I have to emphasize with clients constantly. The phenomena happening, death, for instance, is not the same as your experience. In other words, your experience is not what something is. Okay? Others are having a different experience to one degree or another around the same phenomena as you. Now, the reason New Thought was so radical at its inception, and I think it still is to an extent, and a reason why it won't catch on the way it should, is because this idea that the mind is causative. That's the cosmic villain thing doesn't work there, right? You are responsible for your perception, and therefore you are responsible for your experience. In other words, your thoughts are shaping your experience. You experience what you think or assume, as Neville would say. And again, you have to separate what is happening from what you are experiencing. Maybe a better way to say it would be that you must separate what is happening from the way your mind is relating to it. Okay? And something that I haven't really been getting into, which I think I'll do an episode on it because I haven't talked about it in a while, is that the subconscious mind is the true causative factor. Remember, your subconscious mind is outside of your conscious awareness, and it is responsible for manifesting your experience of the world. It reveals the world to you. The subconscious manifests the world for you, and then the conscious mind elaborates on that experience, causing you to double down on behaviors that are reinforcing that experience, good or bad. So where we land with this stuff is that inner alignment precedes outer change, right? The big mistake is that we believe more in the outside world than the inner world, which leads us to monkeying around out there rather than in here, right? We address outer change rather than inner change, which makes sense that we would do that. But, I get it, but now we have to change it. But here's the dangerous piece. This is where everything kind of goes wrong. This is where things get a bit maladaptive or a bit sticky. New Thought, and later the Abraham-inspired culture that amounts essentially to New Age prosperity gospel, sometimes drifts into mental control. If your thoughts create reality, then every bad thing must be your fault. And that's not the wisest way to move through this stuff. That's cruel metaphysics. And unfortunately, what a lot of these idiots online teach is exactly that. And sure, maybe they don't say that explicitly, But what do you think happens when you continually put out the message that all good things that happen are because of your thinking and that you quote unquote manifested them? Well, if you're a new age hippie that doesn't read much and you don't know about the law of correspondence, then you suffer, right? Neither Buddhism nor Hinduism support that idea. In fact, they both recognize conditioning, they recognize trauma, ignorance, and inertia as factors. Abraham originally did too, but that nuance often gets lost because I believe it gets lost because a lot of these folks that become these online proponents of this stuff or even start teaching, I believe that they are spiritual slobs. They are sloppy spiritual pigs with no practice of their own. All Shakti, no Purusha, to use the previous episode's language. But the through line across Buddhism, Hinduism, New Thought, and Abraham's teachings is that suffering increases when you fight with the experience and clarity increases when resistance to the experience softens. That resistance comes in the form of frantically trying to change what's happening rather than being with what is happening. This doesn't mean that we necessarily lean into what's happening. It means that we are there with the experience, doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done, regardless of how painful or even how blissful the experience is, right? We're not pushing on pain or pulling on pleasure. I realize how odd that may sound, but that's the only way that I'm capable of articulating it. And I hope you can feel into what that would mean. But anyway, that's the through line with these systems we're talking about today. And this comparison matters because it keeps people from becoming attached to any single framework. The reality is that Abraham isn't the final word. Buddhism isn't the final word, and Hinduism isn't the final word, and neither is New Thought. They are filters that you can use to look at things, right? You can look through them at things. And when you understand that, you stop turning spirituality into a test that you can pass or fail. It becomes a tool that it was intended to be. That's what these systems were supposed to be. Everyone learns differently. Everyone sees differently. Everyone hears differently. So there have to be multiple methods. These are all methods for looking at the same thing, and that's all. When we get caught up in needing to prove things to others or even ourselves, that's when we get lost. We wander away from the actual teaching. That's when people become more worried about proving the historic validity of Noah's Ark rather than reading the fucking Sermon on the Mount and living accordingly. I'm not picking on Christianity, but of all the aforementioned systems, they seem to be the most concerned with proving its religious text, the Bible, as to be some historical document rather than a guidebook for spiritual practice. Maybe because there's not a lot of actual instruction. There's just rules. And that takes us back into the previous episode, so I'll spare you the rant. But if Abraham's language helps you soften resistance, then use it. You know, if Buddhism steadies your mind, use that. If Hinduism allows you space to understand God and a different way to understand life as a human, more so than the religion of your birth, then use it. But whatever you do, don't confuse the map for the territory. Do you hear that? The map is not the territory. Belief won't bring alignment. Right? Belief is a thought exercise to understand your life. And out of that may come alignment, but only if you apply the practices and live accordingly, whatever that system may be. You don't have to believe that Abraham is a non-physical collective of beings to respect the phenomenon. But you have to acknowledge that much of human wisdom has come through altered states like dreams, meditation, mystical experience, channeling, even things like automatic writing. In fact, if you read Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, you find out that a lot of our advancements in technology come from individuals admittedly being visited by non-human intelligences. So whether you frame that as channeling or bringing subconscious stuff to the surface or something else entirely, Esther Hicks's material still deserves discernment. It deserves to be looked at. and not to be dismissed. I believe that it's important that we stay skeptical and not cynical. I have a lot of anomalous experiences, and when they occur, I always try to rule out any explainable phenomenon. The problem is I'm always able to rule out the explainable phenomenon and just end up with another weird anomalous experience. But even after all of these years of anomalous experience, mystical experience, I am still skeptical. And I'm skeptical because I'm interested in the truth. I'm not interested in being right. I'm not interested in proving anything. And honestly, I don't know if that's a good thing, right? Sometimes I think that I need to let go and just lean into mysticism and forget skepticism completely. I don't know. I don't know what that thing is. Maybe it's fear. I have no idea. But, it's obviously something I have to look at. So underneath these grids, vortexes, all the terminology, there's a single simple message, right? You don't experience alignment by force, right? Your wounds won't heal through further punishment, and you don't become whole by pretending that everything's fine, right? You return to the state of coherence through allowing yourself to be just where you are over and over again, returning back to this open state of having your experience, acting appropriately, and doing so without all the resistance. Remember, don't push so hard that you become impaled, and don't pull so hard that you get crushed, right? Force won't make the situation change faster. Remember, as annoying as it is, what you resist persists. So if the law, this law of attraction stuff has ever made you feel anxious, pressured, then you were probably taught a distorted version of it, right? The original teaching isn't about being perfect. It's about allowing. It's about feeling what you feel. It's about calibrating as needed. And it's not about punishing yourself. It's about allowing life, God or source, to reorganize your life. I love you. Stay awake. Thank you. If the infinite spark of being has brought you any value, consider supporting the work. And you can do that by checking out Awake and the 90-Day Transformation Journal, both now available on Amazon. The links are in the description. If you want to support this work on a monthly basis, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers that have no locked content yet, just support. You can also swing by the website, check out the merch store, learn more about working with me one-on-one, and as always, the YouTube page has full episodes as well as binaural beats to help you with your practice. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, and I love you.